All right, welcome to America This Week. I'm Matt Taibbi.
And I'm Walter Kirn.
How are you doing, Walter?
I'm doing well. Spring's coming on in Montana. I've been out and about on the roads, traveling around, sort of enjoying myself, getting away from the desk a little. So I feel fit as a fiddle for this week.
Wow.
Yeah.
That sounds great. I'm jealous. I feel like I haven't been outside for 7 months. So
really,
yeah,
really. Well, I mean, the audience can tell just looking at the complexions it's confronted with on this program. But
yeah,
my tan's fading. My tan was of such an intensity that I'm not kidding. I was being hailed as a friend by people of other ethnicities. I really was. I was on the Hopi reservation down in Arizona, and a guy, I said I was from Montana, and he said, "Are you a Blackfoot?" So that's how tanned I was at one point.
Yeah, your tan was like a third character in the show.
Yeah, it was. I tried to light it in ways that would reduce its blinding brownness, but it just. I was at my son's graduation last week in Philadelphia, where everyone was still pale from winter, and I don't think they knew what had happened. That my son could have come from me didn't make much sense given a side by side comparison of our skin tones.
Right. Inspiring awkward quizzical glances.
Yeah. And it's a pretty stuffy crowd at the University of Pennsylvania graduation, so I'm sure many rumors were launched.
Yeah. Good.
Yeah,
it's all positive.
Good. How about you, man?
I'm glad you're feeling. I had a little drama this week, but
that's every week. That's every week. What's little for you? That's great on a curve. You weren't thrown in the pen, or you didn't have more IRS agents at your door, did you, or what?
I had a little IRS complication this week because the stuff came out about why they came to my house and when they opened a case on me and all that stuff. So that was a little weird. The big thing was that I found out that they opened the case on Christmas Eve last year, which was the day that I was dropping the big Twitter file story about the links to the FBI and the CIA and the other government agencies. And
is
I was
Christmas
alone
Eve
in a hotel.
Is Christmas Eve usually a federal work day?
Yeah, not really, as far as I understand. In fact, my understanding is that there's not a whole lot of IRSing that gets done in the last couple of weeks of December. Generally, that's sort of a period where, you take all of your untaken vacation days. So the optics of it were weird on many levels. I'm joking about it, but clearly it's a little upsetting. I've heard from some other people in the interim who've had experiences with the IRS that suggest, that it's not terribly uncommon, for weird dossiers to be opened up about people who have said things that, in the media that have upset, folks in government. So, that's part of my thinking about going to the committee, is that this is a sort of a rare opportunity to find out, how these things happen. Maybe they even will be able to subpoena some records, and so we'll see. But lots of stuff happened in the world this week that's interesting, and we can get to some of that. But you texted me something pretty early in the week, and I watched it, and a chill went up my spine. Did that happen with you when you watched this for the first time?
My spine is pretty frozen these days, but and yet a chill did go up, an extra chill. It was an icicle of a spine froze even further. I think it was the voices involved, which you can introduce, and the production quality of this little video.
Yeah, so this is a video that comes to us by way of Gray Zone and our friends Max Blumenthal, Aaron Mate, and in particular, I guess Anya Parampil, who was there. There was an event in Washington, and Anya describes it as this way. It was Kiev officials and Samantha Power from USAID were in Washington, celebrating how the Ukraine war kicked off a, quote, new age of, quote, e-governance. Alongside the executive chairman of Visa, they are openly describing the sacrifice of Ukrainian civilians on the altar of Western finance and tech. The event is dedicated to promoting Dia, Ukraine's state in a smartphone that digitizes med records, banking, biometric data, and all aspects of life into a singular app. And Dia, by the way, is sort of the Ukrainian word for, I guess, to be or being. It's kind of conceived as like an everything app, right?
So they aimed high with this title. It's the existence.
Right, yeah.
It's the human existence app.
So the Gray Zone folks kind of describe being at this conference, and they keep talking about how the American officials are so excited by kind of the proof of concept of Dia. And remember, Dia is sort of a hybrid creation of USAID, Visa, and Google, among other things. And there's a joke in there that one of the speakers uses as a joke to warm up the crowd, the idea that AI is going to destroy humanity. Then there's a revelation that similar eGov apps are being launched in other countries like Estonia, Zanzibar, and Colombia. Samantha Power, excitedly says something remarkable is happening in Ukraine as we speak. And then they play a video about the Dia app and what it sounds like and what it looks like. And obviously this is in English. There's a Ukrainian analog. I went and looked at it later, but this English language video, the piece of it, just by itself, there's so much to get into here.
So these are a combination of aspiring developers and Ukrainian officials and American diplomats, basically.
Diplomats.
Yeah, in quotes.
Right. Yeah. USAID, I mean, you always have to give an asterisk. It's, it's like Barry Bonds home runs. But yeah. So they roll this video, and man, if this doesn't remind you of a certain sci-fi movie, I don't know what to do. But let's see. Let's take a listen.
Okay.
War bonds aimed at rebuilding the liberated and soon-to-be deoccupied Ukrainian cities. State mortgage. Military, medics, teachers, and scientists can apply for the state mortgage right in the app. E-Enemy, a chatbot that helps any citizen safely transfer info about the location of Russian troops, names of collaborators, and enemy movements to the armed forces. Numerous attacks of Russian army destroyed a number of TV towers. To provide Ukrainians with uninterrupted access to information, we launched Dia Radio and Dia TV, so that even under blackouts, millions could feel present. And added the in-app Army of Drones game to help Ukrainians both distract and donate to the common purpose. Has the enemy launched cyber attacks on Ukraine? Of course they have, and they failed. Even when the world is falling apart, our main task is to protect the people. Together, we can build a stronger one.
So Dia is a snitching app, right? I mean, they have E-Enemy in there. And I went and I did a whole bunch of research on this state in a smartphone concept. There's sort of this happened in stages. The prior president, Petro Poroshenko, he introduced something called Prozoro in, between 2014, 2016. This was designed to be kind of a .gov app that centralized contracting and some other things. improving transparency. And then it was Zelensky who came along and created this concept of the Ministry of Digital Transformation in 2019. And that's when they coined the phrase a digital state in the smartphone, where you could fight corruption and manage complex administrative hurdles, quote, with one click. This became possible thanks to the DIA app, meaning action in Ukrainian. And then it goes into how in addition to all the civilian uses of this, they began to develop, after the war started, some other features for this app. Therefore, in the first days of the war, the Ukrainian government launched the chatbot e-enemy, called e-enemy, designed for Ukrainian citizens to report the Russian military and its equipment's movements and inform the Ukrainian government about the collaborators' activities. The chatbot activity gained over 370,000 visits, most revealing hostile groups. Moreover, the DIA application offered the option to donate to the Ukrainian army, a financial assistance program for businesses affected by the war, and recompensation for damaged properties, a migrant card, assistance, consultations for displaced people, and an e-document for those crossing the border without documents quickly became available in the application. In this way, a mobile phone could confirm people's identity even when the physical copy of the document was lost. So it's your whole life in the phone, and it's a way to report on those who are enemies to the cause. And in Russian, I saw it referred to as Yevrag, so that's enemy, but it sounds a lot more sinister in their language. And I don't know, Walter, this reminded me of Starship Troopers and the whole and a little bit like the DHS thing that we talked about just a couple of weeks ago, where obviously they have more cause to do it in Ukraine, but creating an app, and they talked about the intersection with cybersecurity agencies and developing this stuff. You just start to wonder about the possibilities of this kind of technology.
Well, luckily we're never going to have anything like this in America. That makes me feel good. Just because we developed it, and just because it has the convenience of putting an entire state in a smartphone, doesn't mean we will ever be subjected to it. And I feel great for the Ukrainians that they're in this fashion ahead of us. E-enemy, first of all, I think of that as the opposite of Tinder. If Tinder, the thing that we have in America, allows us to identify potential mates or friends, intimate friends, this allows us to find adversaries everywhere and report them. Maybe have them, disappear from view. I don't know what happens to your e-enemy after you've registered them. I don't know if it's like
I think some reporting needs to be done on that.
Yeah. Is it a 3 strikes thing? Do 3 people have to identify you as an enemy before the drone comes, or does only one person? So let's look at the other things. The attempt to get people into looking for troops and enemy aircraft and so on, I guess, is just a modern version of the spotting that we were asked to do as in America in World War II, right? In a lot of ways, this app, though sinister, only concentrates things that populations at war seek to do all the time, which is, spot threats, identify traitors, loose lips, sink ships, maybe call out people who are talking too much about state secrets. But it also, what was interesting, has all of these sort of domestic, everyday capabilities. So you apply for a mortgage on the same platform that you turn in traitors and spies. You and that is the I think the innovation here, to in this banality of evil fashion, make a kind of financial app, PayPal or Venmo or E-Trade, absolutely adjacent to your militarized um, uh, side of things.
Persona.
Yeah, persona. So it really integrates the civilian soldier and the aspiring middle class homeowner into one into one piece of software. I imagine that if you lose your phone, you death could be more disturbing. Because they talk in this about how this thing replaces other documents and allows you to go on as an identified individual should you lose papers and so on. And it seems that what you've got is a kind of surrogate soul, really, a surrogate body and a surrogate identifier besides your own face.
Yeah, I mean, it's like in Idiocracy when they find Luke Wilson doesn't have a code on his arm, a barcode on his arm,
right?
And they're all freaked out because how come for you don't have a number? They're all terrified because they've never seen that before. But it speaks to the same fear that drove the kind of Canadian trucker movement. This idea that vaccine passports, that the state needs to know our movements somehow, and that is connected somehow to what our record of political donations, and that I think people were deeply worried about this idea of something that smells like a social credit system. Now, it makes more sense in a combat environment where a lot of these functions seem to have a lot of utility to them. Like if you get lost, where's the nearest place you can find medical help and first aid, right, and all that stuff. Right. And yes, if you see tanks rolling over the horizon, it's great to be able to tell Central Command where they're, what you saw. But you can also imagine all sorts of applications for this that are a little bit less black and white, especially in given the background of what we've trained people in the internet age to do. We've already created systems where reporting people online for their behavior is a thing that we've become accustomed to doing, and that it's effective. It puts them on denial lists. It sort of knocks them down as social media citizens. You can end up being kicked off a platform, and then your record of being kicked off the platform follows you around for a while like a virus. And so we've already sort of trained a population to have like one-click reporting of people next door. And I don't know that because of that, this makes me nervous.
So Matt,
I don't know.
So years ago, do you remember the no-fly list? The no-fly list was an early form of physical and practical cancellation. And we were told that it was somehow filtering out possible terrorists. But I had a friend who was a short order cook here in Livingston who managed to get on the no-fly list because he had a altercation in a plane with a guy who turned out to be an air marshal. And once he was on the no-fly list, his life changed. For example, a relative died suddenly and unexpectedly in a town across the country. And getting there became very difficult to the funeral. Getting there to the funeral became very difficult. All of a sudden, he had a very arduous life on his hands. And, whether he earned his no-fly list membership, I can't speak to, but once he was on it, life got very tough indeed. And what was interesting in talking to him was how the avenues for appeal were few. And it also became clear that local authorities could place you on this no-fly list, your local sheriff, for example. And ever getting off it,
ICE agents.
yeah, ever getting off it seemed a real dicey proposition. It was like trying to cancel the vitamin subscription that I tried to cancel the other day. You just couldn't find the right person, and when you found them, they were hostile, and then the connection broke. But in any case, so all of these hassles that come with being identified as a dubious person will, I'm sure, be built into this thing. In other words, it will not only have this positive affirmative capability, allowing people to identify others, turn others in, apply for mortgages, and so on, but it will probably have a capacity that that is negative and keeps you from getting a mortgage, or makes it harder to get a mortgage, or alerts you to the fact that you've been turned in, and you should probably report somewhere to clear things up with the authorities. To be
shrink wrapped to a naked to a light pole in the middle of Kiev.
So no wonder they used this echoey, futuristic, non-human or semi-human voice to announce it, because I think they were trying to disorient people and cause them not to think too hard in that first moment. They introduced it with a lot of fanfare as a pure positive. I'm surprised we didn't hear forced applause from the audience. But they only told one side of the story about Dia, which was what it's like to be sort of the gunslinger of Dia rather than the gunned down. They talked, like I say, about how it might help you get a home, but they didn't mention that the corollary must be there too. It can probably stop your mortgage application cold. Luckily, as I say, we'll never have this in America, so I can only speculate on what its effects will be. But I wonder how many Ukrainians there in the audience, in the midst of this war, which is incredibly violent, devastating, and is taking out the infrastructure of this country, had a feeling of inner sunrise about the digital landscape that will come and that will come and redeem the experience of the soon-to-be deoccupied cities of the country. That was a little weird language, wasn't it? It assumed a kind of easy, blithe success that's just around the corner that I'm not sure is real, or can be easily assumed. It might have been nice if it was a little more dystopian and a little more dramatic and said something in the post-nuclear wasteland that Ukraine may be. There is a bright spot. Those few survivors will include those traitors who caused the destruction, and you will be able to identify them through your phone. There won't be much left, but vengeance will be yours and at your fingertips.
That's right. With a click of a button, you too can have Volodya removed to a black site in Djibouti, and have him put in have him stand in a box with electrodes on his testicles for a while, or that could be handled locally too. I mean, there's no reason why that can't happen also.
The presentation buried a lot of leads. Sure. One was that you can't really trust the power grid anymore, but don't be discouraged. One was that the media might, as conventionally defined, might disappear, but you have Dia. This notion that there will be mortgages to be had and applied for was a little optimistic. I thought, in general, it had like you say, the absolutely chilling tones of a science fiction movie like Starship Troopers. It Why do they make their propaganda sound so terribly sinister? I mean, don't they have consultants who could make it a little warm and fuzzy, like those endearing insurance commercials? Couldn't Flo introduce Dia, or some
Jake
kind
from
of
State Farm?
Yeah. Because frankly, all I could hear when I listened was a voice that was a combination of airport paging, being called to the principal's office over the school speaker system, something that I imagine might be blasted on loudspeakers from helicopters at some point in our future evolution, and so what are they trying to do to us with these things? I mean, I guess this was only for an inside group. This wasn't meant to get out to the general public, but sometimes I wonder if they just are menacing on purpose with this stuff. It's just a little poke.
Well, this gives you a little glimpse into what it's like when you see lobbyists and or contractors talking to each other. This stuff never gets covered really in the news media, and it's very rare that you see widespread sort of viral circulation of this kind of material. I've spent a little time around people like this, and time around people in the finance community who say horrifying things about how we're going to make more money going into low-income neighborhoods, and yeah, they always forget that there is another audience out there that might hear this. But this stuff is particularly, I think they've gone several levels in a new direction in terms of being out of touch with how horrifying this sounds, because not only are they creating an app for thinking on your neighbors, they're creating an app that puts your entire life in one unified sort of shared endeavor paradigm where all your information is in one place, and I'm assuming that the decisions are interrelated somehow, that the authority is all centralized.
Right.
I mean, that sounds nightmarish to me, but they are excited about it. Yeah.
Matt, I'm gonna advertise myself as a novelist here. In 2005, I published a novel called The Unbinding. It was first published in a serial fashion in Slate magazine, and then as a trade paperback. And the premise of my book was that in this near future, everyone wore a bracelet which was attached to a service called AidSat, Aid Satellite. And there were operators on call, and it was sort of like the OnStar service that they were starting to put into GM cars. At any point, this bracelet of yours, which was your best friend, your alter ego, and everything that the iPhone would be, because we didn't have iPhones when I wrote the novel. You could be doing things like negotiating for a car, say, and run into a problem with the salesman, and you could just ask AidSat to start coaching you in your ear through the negotiation. You could use it for everything. And the reason I called the book The Unbinding was that when I thought through the logic of this technology, I realized that what it ultimately was going to do was displace people's identities from their actual bodies. The decisions, our decisions, were going to be made remotely, and they were going to be reported to remote beings and centers. And all our body was ever going to do after that was just carry this DIA or this AidSat bracelet around. We were at that point drones, functional drones.
Right.
And we were eyes and ears for the state, and we were at the furthest end of all these decision making processes about our economic life and so on. And there was in me an apprehension about why people would ultimately go on when all of the executive functions of life were now off site.
Right.
And much hilarity and many complications and dystopian situations ensued. But the essence of this was to examine the problem of having a alter self in a machine directly linked to authority, and also in some ways more powerful in our fate than we were, quote unquote, we. So it's really a new ego and a new superego, certainly, and it's on a it's on a disc or a chip, and it's not just the surveillance possibilities or the censorship possibilities or the life interrupting possibilities. It's the fact that you start to wonder if your brain is even meaningful as something to carry with you, or just baggage.
Right. It's secondary. It's down a level from your DIA or your bracelet, your AidSat bracelet, or your DIA app. This is a great moment for me. This is my first time I get to actually make a Gogol reference on the show. So this reminds me of The Nose. You ever read that story?
Yes.
So it's about this sort of mid-level bureaucrat who's a jerk and a womanizer and kind of a soulless but creepy dude. But he wakes up one morning expecting to have a day of going out and taking advantage of other people and kicking around peasants or whatever he does. He does. He wakes up and his nose is gone. It's somehow magically been sliced off by his barber. And the story is sort of ridiculously and nonsensically turns into a detective story where he chases his nose around St. Petersburg. And when he finally encounters it, it's standing in a church, and it's dressed in a uniform with like one rank above his, and has like better clothes and a longer sword and everything. And he tries to approach it, and he's like, "Excuse me, you're my own nose." And the nose looks at him and is like, "You must be mistaken, and I can see, from your badge that you serve in a different department." But that internal fear that, I think this was there's a little bit of an early response to the bureaucratic state here where, my own self is actually somehow less than whatever it is some other authority deems me to be, and I can be separated from that at any moment. And here, this is it feels like a dystopian version of that, right? Like your DIA app or whatever it is, your social credit score, it has a life of its own apart from your mere biological self with a soul and all that. Is that a fanciful comparison? It feels
no,
right
it's not.
But
I mean, the dreamers of the 19th century who could feel these tendencies emerging in society could only use metaphorical and surreal imagery to express them. But the nose and DIA are really similar. I imagine that just as there are people who have gamed the credit scoring system, I know some real scumbags who have incredibly good credit scores. I know some people who live for their credit scores. I wrote a novel about a guy up in the air who has put everything into his frequent flyer account. He has adjusted all his credit cards, his hotel use, pretty much all of his behavior such that it generates points for his frequent flyer account. And once again, I was talking about the way that when they present human beings with a game and a way of winning at it, people will deform their entire lives to achieve victory. And so when you put in something like DIA or the state in a smartphone, people are going to very quickly optimize their behavior to get the most benefits from it. They will also defensively try to protect themselves from its worst potentials. But what you can be sure of, good or bad, that will happen with the advent of these things is that the human being will change radically. That you will basically have gamified human existence and created a set of incentives and penalties that will make sort of DIA achievers out of people, and I don't know what that will consist of. Will people feel like local cops that they should meet a certain quota every month in terms of turning people in? Like you say, there's a utility to these things always initially that solves problems we've always had. But after a while, what we know about technology is that its imperatives tend to overwhelm its initial cases for use. And if you really are having a hard time and you need to get ahead on DIA this month, you want that mortgage to go through, maybe there is actually a dating app in DIA. I don't see why not. I mean, you can maybe make a date on one screen and then turn in
and then dime her out to
yeah. Well, actually, the merger of the two is the ultimate weapon. You can do your own honeypots. You can have a filter that makes you look incredible. An AI can sort of optimize your profile for each person that you're hunting, and so you can draw in people from the bar or the hotel across the street, and you can both have sex with them and get the story on their loyalties. And at the end, you have a choice. Do you want to date them again, or do you want to see them imprisoned? It will add a piquancy to sexual interaction that we just don't have right now, but which I know
that's
that
true.
This will all merge. The state in a smartphone sounds to me like something a certain kind of person will do well with, and those are usually people I don't like. In other words, one reason I'm hostile to this technology is that the people who are going to master it are the people I've never liked in life.
No, that's absolutely true. And we kind of already know who they are. We've been seeing the personalities who thrive with this kind of thing. And, in the last 8-9 years or so, they've become more and more prominent. Interestingly, Nina Jankowicz was actually, I found a connection to her with this, the Eurasian Foundation was one of the developers, I think, for DIA, and she's on that board. And so you can find all sorts of folks who have popped up on your list of, unpleasant characters. And if you dig deep enough, they have some kind of connection to this project. But also, and we're going to talk about a story that I think is very on point to this later, right? Forster's The Machine Stops. But the other thing that this does when you have a centralized information, hub, is that it trains people to internalize what correct messaging is, what the right thing to think and say is. Just like Starship Troopers, it merges the public service message, go out and step on bugs, with constant patriotic updates about what's happened in the world. We just had a major victory in Klendathu. Our people are great. Go out and do your part. And that's similar. That, like, the news has kind of turned into that. There was an amazing thing that happened this week. It didn't get a lot of play because that's how this works. But the New York Times ran a story this week. Ukrainians were likely behind Kremlin drone attack, U.S. officials say. American spy agencies do not exactly know who carried out the attack this month, but suggest it was part of a series of covert operations orchestrated by Ukraine's security service. So there, the arc of these kinds of things is now, it's so predictable, right? I mean, like, at first they come out full-throated, it's a false flag, it didn't happen. Then,
by the way, that is class. That initial stage in which they say something like this is a false flag, that is disinformation defined, just so we don't lose track of what that word means. That is what it is. Right.
And, obviously the Russians do it too. I forget what they did in the last couple of weeks. That was kind of amazing. They did a sort of classic disinformation campaign. It's slipping on my mind. But anyway, this whole thing where we've trained people to accept the day one news, and then it kind of erodes, the disinformation erodes over time because it's not believable. And then quietly 30 days later, they tell you, through anonymous sources, yes, it's exactly the opposite of what we told you, but whatever,
But you should believe us then, and you should believe us now.
Exactly. We want you to be comfortable with the contradiction, not worry about it. It's cool.
Orwell called that doublethink, but I call it time-sensitive information. See, why information is only intelligible in terms of its temporal context. And right after something happens, when it's still kind of disturbing in a headline, you should have one kind of information around it, that which, places it in a useful context. But as people adjust to the shock of the Kremlin having been attacked, you can then give another, perhaps more truthful or perhaps just alternative story that people will accept. And for some reason, the powers that be decided we're ready to accept, or we should even be eager to know about, this new Ukrainian capacity to use small units to get deep into Russia. So that's where we have it. Because I saw this story framed in the context of a sort of a new Ukrainian tactic or strategy to use small sort of guerrilla type operations against the enemy that aren't directed by the central military authority in the same way. In other words, we as allies of Ukraine were supposed to be cheered by this, I think, weren't we not? Isn't that the way the story came forward?
Let's see.
Or was it to demonstrate some fracturing of the command structure in Ukraine?
No, the U.S. is saying that the part of a series of operations that have made officials in the United States uncomfortable, so they're distancing themselves from this publicly. But this happened in the context of incursions in Belgorod, right? Which some people are saying calling civil war. Other people are saying there was that Ukrainians were behind it. There was a little bit of a delay again with news reporting in that story. Then there's also the continuing saga of Nord Stream reports, right? We had more European reports claiming that Ukrainians were behind that this week. So, who knows? It's yeah. I mean, I think they're training audiences to accept conflicting stories, and they're having the
and they're training audiences to accept a certain life cycle in the news that in which there are sort of a 3-act, in which there's a 3-act structure. There's what happens first, then there's the confusing part in the middle where we tell you a news story, but maybe we tell it to you reluctantly. Sad to announce that Ukraine is doing disturbing things on its own, but rather successfully, we must say. And then comes the third act, in which we are given the story that we're supposed to lodge in our memory ever after, as we move into the beginning of a news cycle. I don't think anyone hearing strong declarations from our officials now has any real expectation that they're definitive. We're all cynics now, and some of us are grateful cynics. I like it when my information cycle is nicely managed by the people at the top. I expect no less. I like it when disinformation, because they have disinformation, malinformation, and what was the other one? Of the three,
dismiss and mal.
Okay, but what is good disinformation? In other words, what is the kind of disinformation when our intelligence people come out early and say this was a false flag on the Russians' part, and we later find that that's not
information warfare?
Right. Okay.
Isn't
so
that
that's
what they
when
call it? Remember they announced this? Yeah.
Right. Right. Because when I reflect back on the false flag stuff, say I'm just totally in the tank for the regime in every way. I'm grateful that they, for a while, had people convinced it was a Russian false flag, because that underlined our sense of the perfidy and deceptiveness of the Russians. It gave another hit to people who believe that they can't trust them in any way. And though it turned out to be true, it had a sort of salubrious, healthy intellectual effect in further angering us about those slimy people in the Kremlin. So we need a new word that expresses good lying.
Yeah, they have to. Yeah, Orwell would come up with something like that, right? Like good fraud, or fraud happy, or something like that, right?
Right.
I mean, it would.
Good fraud's pretty good. Good. I think we should stick with that, because
it's like good friend.
We're going to have examples of it, galore. I promise you. Now that we've identified it and are able to see it, we'll notice it everywhere. And so nice, good fraud, Leon Panetta, when you told us without, without any shilly-shallying that the Russians had done this to themselves. But what's great about the real professional good fraud purveyors is that they then appear later, a month later, to tell the different story with the exact same confidence that they put forth the wrong one. It's like Jim Cramer's stock picks. Only, there are no apologies.
I love the Kramer ETF is one of the funniest things in the world.
In other words,
you're absolutely right.
It's this life cycle. It's like the life cycle of the mayfly that we're familiar with in Montana trout streams. It starts out underwater as a worm, then it rises up into the air as a fly and hatches on the surface, and then it then it falls to the river as what they call a spinner, a kind of dead, desiccated thing that has already mated, and then it floats away and becomes part of a big sludge of dead insects. And the life cycle of the mayfly.
I mean, that's a great metaphor for news stories, isn't it?
It's going to be my go-to metaphor if I can only remember it. Yeah. And so now this story is headed toward spinner status. It will sort of harden, fall to the surface, and then it will go downstream and join this great sludge of stories that now are, have no more energy in them.
Yeah, the thing that's really remarkable about this, and this is going to come up when we talk about the Forster, but this kind of thing only works with a population whose memory is basically zero. Well, if the news consumer is able to maintain any kind of recollection of what they heard a week ago, and they insist on keeping that information in their head and storing it in the same place as the stuff they're hearing today, there's going to be a conflict. But psychologically, people are developing in a way that they just don't do that anymore, and they don't mind the pile up of all that sludge,
Matt, that's why they call it the news. It's ever new. It's, every day you wake up to the news and it's new. It's completely detached from the news you heard yesterday, let alone 2 weeks ago. It's fresh. You believe it with your whole being. You awaken to it as a complete revelation of reality. And when you go to sleep, it's gone. And when you wake up tomorrow, new news comes. The news has never been newer. And one thing that it does is it soothes anxiety. Because if you have a memory, Matt, I've decided to speak on behalf of the Borg. I've decided to stop fighting and learn to love the bomb, and I'm going to now be the voice of Dia and all such things. What people want, Matt, as Patty Chayefsky probably described in Network, is an ever new, emotional, and refreshed reaction that keeps them located in the present. Be here now. Remember the 60s? We want always to have new things to be outraged by, new things to be excited about, new things to look forward to, and new things to be amused by. And any tug from the past that causes that to be difficult will be eliminated, and I think people will welcome it. Largely, I mean, I don't know that in my own observations of the Ukraine war, I've ever been able to hold more than 3 days worth of action in my head. They've trained me successfully on this issue. I wake up every day, every week to a news story about who's winning and who's losing and what the latest success is and the latest thing to be excited about. And I just take it in because not only do I not have a memory, they haven't given me a chronicle of any coherence that would allow me to have one.
Yeah, all that remains are the emotional imperatives. We know the evil, always Satan, is in the Kremlin. They are always scheming. They always must be stopped. They are both a terrifying threat and absolutely slated to lose at the same time. Like these are the things that are constants. The
Dia presentation treated total success, the quote deoccupation that's coming soon, as a given. I mean, it's like the fact that the NFL will start playing again this fall. It's something we can put on the calendar. There was no anxiety about a hostile environment for Dia taking hold in Ukraine, the ground was being cleared for a wonderful advent. And I think that of all the things about this culture from which Dia emerges, of all the things that bother me, what bothers me most is its ability to imagine a world in that never comes. These people truly are fantasists, and that presentation was an epic little piece of fantasy because it didn't even consider the notion that there would be any obstacles to Dia, whether they be in the emotions of the people it would be thrust on, the poor Ukrainians. You know, the poor Ukrainians will, should this war be successful, be a gutted, exhausted, and temporarily impoverished people. And their excitement
generationally, probably, right?
Generationally. And their excitement over a state in a smartphone will probably be tempered by, in many cases, lack of limbs and things like that.
Lost children.
And to just glide through the atmosphere the way these people do at these conferences, talking about technology as though it lands in the hands of angels rather than people who've just fought a war and lost people in a war, is freaky to me. Like, it's emotionally freaky. I imagine these people all run out and sleep with each other afterwards because at some level they know that they can only find love in each other's arms. They've left the species and have disqualified themselves emotionally for normal love. But I'm sure that they hook up with each other with an intensity I dare not imagine.
Yeah, it's probably similar to presidential campaigns, but it was totally chilling. That presentation made me. I was immediately thinking about Starship Troopers because I remember when I first saw that movie having the thought that we had already. Because I watched that movie again during the Gulf War, and I remember having the thought then that it can't get any more like this than this. But this sort of all knowing, all powerful information system that's constantly feeding us messages, and if you go back and watch the movie now, basically Moscow is Klendathu. Putin is the brain bug. I mean, like it's like a 1-to-1 absolute parallel. And this is our future. I think we're going to be living in this information environment that's going to be like fully militarized, and it's going to algorithmically, measure us in terms of where we are on the spectrum of, aligned with the fight or not, and stuff's all terrifying.
And what they never tell you, so Samantha Powers was there. Samantha Powers and her husband, Cass Sunstein.
Yeah, I think that's right.
Cass Sunstein, the Harvard professor who gave us something called nudge theory, which was basically government-run behavior modification. And let's not kid ourselves. The real goal of a state in a smartphone is modification of your behavior. It may present itself and sell itself as an opportunity for you to do things, but really it's an opportunity for places like Visa, who was sitting there in the audience, to do things to you. And you accept one of these things, and you are accepting being molded in a way that you can't imagine by entities that you will never see.
Yeah, and sorry, go ahead.
And so the thing I also want to add is what they were talking about in this conference was what we used to call reconstruction. They were assuming the end of this war and talking about how they would rebuild society. And usually in the old days, it would be companies like Bechtel that would reconstruct shattered dams and irrigation systems and come in and, rebuild power plants and so on. And that will all go on. But there's a new kind of reconstruction, post-war reconstruction, that the Visa Corporation and USAID are contemplating, and that is the digital reconstruction of a society, or the digital new construction of a society, since this thing is very innovative. And now that's a new feature of war. How will we reconstruct the information space once it has been completely leveled? They almost sounded a little happy about power going out and media being interrupted in that thing, because it gave this thing a chance to shine. It really is only useful in a disaster, or it's most useful in a disaster. So they didn't hide that satanic glee that comes through with defense contractors, in which they know that their fortunes are linked to really bad things that have to happen first.
Yeah, there's so much to digest there, and they did seem really happy about it, and war gives them the opportunity to create the Eden of, sort of total information awareness that we got a glimpse of in the Bush years. Now they have the tools to actually create it. Probably nudge theory is probably built into it. There's probably pictures of when they want us to go out shopping. There's probably pictures of rivers and sunshine on the app, because that makes us feel comfortable. If they want us to stay inside, they'll have a picture of somebody in a mask. They've probably mastered this stuff to a degree that is, beyond the comprehension of most people. But
but quite simply, Matt, if you have this thing on your phone, if this is your phone, do you listen to a podcast like America This Week on that phone? Never.
Probably not.
Making phones into states in a box pretty much rules out any consumption of information that might not please the state, right? I mean, it's over by the time you get to this technology. All diversity of opinion has been implicitly ruled out, I think.
I mean, I already, not to divert too much, but I already have a 2-tiered searching system. I have my Tor browser life and I have my Chrome life, and I feel like it's a necessity. But anyway, just I know there's one thing we probably wanted to touch on quickly before we moved on, but there was a big thing that happened this week that in the information technology area, media area, that got a lot of press. Do you have any thoughts about the Twitter Spaces, Ron DeSantis announcement? Innovation. I saw a lot of exploding heads about this as though it were the end of the world. And then I saw other people like Brian Stelter comparing it to Ross Perot announcing on CNN in the early 90s. I didn't think it was, but anyway, I'd be curious to hear your thoughts.
Well, I tried to tune in and I was one of those who couldn't. It was glitchy early on, and then I didn't, figuring it was going to go on being glitchy. And then I found out afterwards that they recovered and had a massive audience. I didn't notice a lot of sort of greatest hits coming out of it. In other words, there weren't a lot of clips from the thing in, which DeSantis shined or didn't shine. The fact that it happened seemed to be the story. I also saw that Musk said it drove a lot of first-time Twitter signups. He said they were, going ballistic or something, the number of signups. So it seems to have been very good for Twitter. How good it was for DeSantis, I'm not sure. The level of interest in it would suggest there's interest in his candidacy. I guess that's good. Whether he said anything memorable, I don't know. But that it didn't happen on TV is notable. people are going to expect this now. People are going to expect other announcements, which are coming to take place on Twitter, maybe not exclusively, but partially at least. So things are moving, definitely. I mean, this is, I don't see any way around it, a loss for cable television. And because it comes before a future Tucker Carlson show on Twitter, whose outlines we don't understand yet, but which seems to have been promised. I think if I were at conventional media, I'd be worried. I'd really be worried. They could scoop a lot in a short time, and it seems that in every presidential election, we see a new media sort of come up, going back to the legendary televised debates with Nixon and Kennedy and on through. And there was a time when talk radio played a huge part, and there was a time when Facebook played a huge part, and maybe it is Twitter's turn to be the decisive form of media in a presidential election.
Yeah, I mean, I think Twitter had a huge role in 2016 in a way that the powers that be didn't like. Then it had a huge role in the opposite direction in 2020. And, this is probably more back in the direction of Twitter out of pocket with the rest of media. But right. This is all happening against the backdrop of historically chaotic campaign season. As a former campaign reporter, I would normally be in Iowa already now, because the campaign would have progressed to a point where people were already, really hoofing it, doing a lot of stump events, and the quote unquote invisible primary would already have taken place, and there would have been already enormous sums of money shoveled to one candidate or another. Now, Trump has a massive lead in the polls. He's up 44, I think, in Iowa. But the only stories we've seen about what's going on in the Republican Party show that they're not lining up endorsements for Trump. So the quote unquote invisible primary looks like it's a dead thing, like the thing where you line up money endorsements, like county party chairs and newspapers all get lined up before the campaign starts. That no longer has any impact at all. You add in the new uncertainty about media and, the total inability to even predict who could be the candidate in either party. This feels like the most chaotic campaign in our history to me. But
I have a sense that the candidates for the U.S. presidency in 2024 are not yet known to us in some way. Sometimes, I mean, second to Trump on the Republican side is DeSantis, a distant second. But right next to him is Vivek Ramaswamy, not far behind, who has really just had a kind of social media campaign so far. They say Pence is going to get in and a bunch of sort of retread candidates. But I get this feeling that things are so chaotic that almost anything could happen. The weird thing about DeSantis to me is that he will have to profit from the persecution of Donald Trump. In other words, say Trump is further indicted, which I'm told is likely. Well, that's a plus for Ron DeSantis. But to be the Republican candidate that profits from the quote deep state's persecution of your rival is a weird situation, and very alienating, I think, to the base. To keep moving up as what your base perceives as the enemy takes down your rival is an odd vibe for a primary. So I don't know that Ron DeSantis can thread that needle. he's going to have to turn around if he gets the nomination and say, "Hey, everything that just happened to Donald Trump there, that I just profited from, which helped get me the nomination, I'm against."
Right.
In order to win over his base, he'll have to do something like that. I don't see how that happens.
His is a very difficult message. He's got to sell himself as the more rational, more less chaotic Republican alternative who's will make the trains run more on time than Trump did, and so he's more acceptable to the establishment. But is that a positive or negative? I think in the end of the day, it's probably a negative, but we'll see, I guess.
I think that more than I've ever seen, the Republican base and the Republican elite are at each other's damn throats. They hate each other. I think the Republican base in some way despises its leadership more than it does the Democrats. And would easily make the cussed move of just throwing it down and not doing anything if they see another Mitt Romney or Jeb bearing the standard. They are a deeply alienated political faction with, in my mind, a lot of reason to be. Yeah. On the Democratic side, you're going to have this RFK Jr. challenge, which will be met with just a complete squeeze on funds, visibility, and so on. His name and his distinctive story are probably inviolable at a certain level, but to rise above that level is going to be incredibly difficult, given that every trick in the book is going to be used. And so his campaign is going to turn into something like the Trump campaign was, it seems to me, because if he persists, he's going to have to be at the throat of his own establishment mercilessly and continually. And so that's going to be fascinating.
Yeah, and especially since we now know, Dennis Kucinich is managing his campaign. Looking back at Bernie Sanders, Bernie had a great run in 2016 that I think went wrong and went even more wrong in 2020 when his instinct to be a good Democrat kind of kicked in over and over again. He just wasn't able to be an arsonist for the against the party, and it's hard for me to fault him for that. He had a deep affection for the Democratic Party. I think that's absent with this campaign. I think they are ready to go to the mattresses against the Democratic Party establishment, and that's already earned them a big poll bounce. And I'm guessing that'll continue, but we'll see, I suppose, right? But yeah, it's the degree to which both of the two parties are out of tune with how much they're hated by their base is interesting still.
Yeah. There's going to be a lot of grotesque and unexpected drama, which is why I think that out of this melee will emerge something that we haven't anticipated, because both parties are going to get ugly. And I don't know that the ability to suppress RFK Jr. Is great enough to manage his candidacy, as a media phenomena. It could break out.
Well, it'll be interesting to see. I mean, it's so interesting because we spent so much of the Twitter files looking at RFK's name over and over again as kind of the avatar of what was going to be denial listed or banned on all these platforms. So he's going to be a test case for all that.
I don't think I'm talking out of school when I note that RFK Jr.'s profile was raised by a certain Fox host named Tucker Carlson. And Tucker Carlson is coming back to this Twitter presently, or at some point in this campaign, in this election season. He's going to come back to much fanfare and to a whole new ability to be candid. And he will, I am sure, be talking to RFK Jr. And if no one else provides RFK a forum, I expect that Carlson will.
Mm-hmm.
And that could be a big wild card.
Absolutely. Yeah. Well, I'm looking forward to it. Well, before we go, do you want to? We should talk about the machine stops. I thought this was a really good choice, just because of the Dia thing. I hadn't read the story since I was really young. I get probably early 20s. Ian Forster's a writer who I always associated more with the the Merchant Ivory productions, and I never really read his sci-fi dystopian books as much, but I did read this story a long time ago, and when I reread it this week, the degree to which it aligns 100% basically with everything we just talked about Dia is it's pretty remarkable. Like as predictive literature, it's amazing, because it basically just describes a world where it's a bunch of people who are living underground, and there is a machine that does everything for them. And when an older woman has a son who suggests that there is a way to live without this machine on the surface of the planet, that is just excluded from her ratiocination. She can't even process the possibility or her disappointment about it. I don't know. Maybe you could introduce the story a little better, but to me, the machine stops is almost like a story about living in Dia, and the degree to which he nailed so many things is pretty amazing.
Okay, so this story is written in 1909 and published in the Cambridge or Oxford Cambridge Review, some small high-end literary magazine. Let's think about 1909. We're well before World War I. We're well before really the automobile and the airplane. In the story, there are airships. They seem to be dirigibles of some kind. But it anticipates almost everything in an intuitive fashion. And what allows it to do that? You've got people living alone. They live alone underground, and they conduct all their interactions with each other through this screen, through this device that may as well be a tablet, okay, an iPhone or a tablet. They want to live that way because they've become very unused to human company. When the woman at the center of the story is forced out on a trip to go to the surface, she's absolutely disgusted by the company of her fellow people. She can't stand how they smell. She can't stand how they act. What people do in their little hexagonal underground cells, besides talk and be entertained by these tablet screens, is that they have ideas. This goes on in the story. It's a theme about people having ideas, because there's no longer a physical dimension to existence. In the story, they actually kill all the young athletes early in their lives because they know they'll be so frustrated by the physical constraints of life. People have turned into these kind of blobs, and so all they do is cogitate. And so controlling the ideas they have in their cells is the greatest business of the machine. And because it doesn't have to control them physically anymore, they're all penned up. They're basically in jail, happily so. So the intellectual regimen under which they live is one that has certain rules. And among the greatest is you're not to have any firsthand ideas, quote unquote.
Oh, yeah. I got to find that. That was amazing. Mm-hmm.
Yeah. the idea here, or the notion here, is that when ideas are first born, they're born of human passion, and they're therefore dubious. The best thing to do is to have ideas at 10th hand that have been passed through 10 different authority figures. And people actually fear in this society, and this is the dystopian detail that I think is most prescient. They actually fear having a new idea or an original idea because there is safety in being derivative, in being a copycat. And how he had that insight, which is beyond even Orwell, really astonishes me in 1909. The thing about dystopianism is that it's now so old. It started really back in the 19th century. And then it flowered at the beginning of the 20th, and we're seeing themes in our society now play out that were thoroughly explored intellectually over 100 years ago.
And I mean, the fact that they must have, at the dawn of the whole mass organizational man process, there must have been just very smart people who thought, well, what's the ultimate end game of this? Where does this go? I mean, that's clearly what they're talking about here. But the ability to see it, I mean, I would have had a hard time writing this, and I feel like I live this 1,000 times a day. But you just take the passage that you just referenced. This was an amazing prediction. It goes like this: "Beware of first-hand ideas," exclaimed one of the most advanced of them. "First-hand ideas do not really exist. They are but the physical impressions produced by live and fear. And on this gross foundation, who could erect a philosophy? Let your ideas be second-hand, and if possible, 10th-hand, for then they will be far removed from that disturbing element, direct observation." And that's exactly, we were just talking about this, the whole thing about don't do your own research. Right? Like, what does that even mean, doing your own research? Or this was a massive theme of the COVID messaging is, don't make your own observations. Don't listen to things that you see online that may be true, but they'll be misleading. Like, go to the authorities, where, the sort of properly laundered version of reality is presented to you. And don't come to your own conclusions. Don't do your own thinking. And they train this population to be physically recoil from anything new, to be very uncomfortable in human company. You mentioned the main character in the story. She doesn't even want to have a human servant because it's less comfortable for her than the automatic one that just moves her around the room, on command. And how did they see that coming in 1909? I mean, that's just so much like what happens when you spend too much time on the iPad. You become very reluctant to engage with people physically in real life. And how they saw that, I have no idea. But it's very incisive.
Well, one way they saw it, or one way they could anticipate it, is that among them were the people who planned it. And by that, I mean this. This story is a reaction to an H.G. Wells story, I believe, isn't it? Did H.G. Wells write The Time Machine, or is that Jules Verne? I've read that The Machine Stops is a kind of pessimistic retort to a more optimistic story, The Time Machine. So,
yeah,
in other
Time
words,
Machine is 1895. Yeah, Wells.
By Wells, yeah. And now, who was H.G. Wells? H.G. Wells was a Fabian socialist, historian, thinker, believed in free love, was a progressive. When progressive really meant sort of thinking ahead into human history and what we might become versus what we had been. He wrote, one of my favorite books, which is a 2-volume history of civilization, and he described civilization up until the early part of the last century as a progress toward a greater and greater unification of mankind under more and more rational principles. Okay, he really was the globalist. He saw that if we could get rid of our prejudices, get rid of our sort of regional and tribal conflicts, and leverage the technology that it was coming online. He was a real optimist about technology. We could create this future state that solved all the problems that went back to the beginning of time, our violence, our irrationality, our tribalism, our sort of perversity and greed. And so you have actual H.G. Wells thinking about a positive future, dreaming it up as early as 1895, and then going out politically. And he was a very influential figure in British politics, British society, and in world intellectual circles, and trying to make it happen, advocating for things like the League of Nations and so on. And what Forster, a more private, I think, melancholy soul, did in this story was he simply looked at the dark side of what Wells and those other circles in London and other places were proposing. And he said, let me make the worst case scenario.
Right.
And so it wasn't so much that people were just lying around in opium dens dreaming the future. They were engaged in active debates. I mean, this as a student of Russian literature. You read a book like Dostoevsky's Demons, and you see that all the arguments about what society was to become and where it was supposed to go were raging, in the middle of the 19th century, obviously.
It's true. And some of them are really annoying. You want to go back in time and like beat them all up, but yeah, go ahead.
Right. So I'm saying that Forster needn't have been a complete prophet. He was around people who were actively trying to create the architecture for a future society out of technology, a kind of socialist political organization, what they believe to be a more rational use of resources, and the sort of rewriting of the human soul, and also probably the dispensing with religion, traditional religion, which H.G. Wells makes endless fun of in his history of the world. And so Forster was just making the other case, and he made it masterfully. He just went right to the end stage. In fact, the world is so quiescent, so still, so passive in the machine stops that the story only begins when this perfectly undramatic existence that everyone lives starts to break down. The water stops running in their little cells. The music that's being delivered through tubes becomes discordant, and they start to have to contemplate the notion that the all-loving machine that gives them everything, that has become godlike, that really resembles a kind of best case that I hear for AI sometimes, in which it just totally takes over from us in this benevolent way, but it starts to break down, and people confront this terrible anxiety, because the story to me is really about trust. humans have actually stopped administering this machine by the time we get to the story. Nobody really knows how it works. It's operating on inertia, and no one is sure where it's located, who controls it. There's something called the Central Committee that keeps being referred to, but it seems very distant and abstract. And when the thing starts breaking, people contemplate having to return to a life before the machine that they can't remember. They don't and are absolutely ill-equipped for. It's sort of like the people who, when COVID quarantines were ending, said, "I'm not sure I'm ready to go back out there. I need a little more time."
Well, they're still doing it.
Yeah.
Right. I mean,
how quickly that state of somnolent trust develops, and how hard it is to shake off.
Yeah, I mean, I hadn't thought about that with Wells and the fact that this kind of book would be written against the backdrop of this movement. I mean, Wells was a futurist in a lot of the same ways that somebody like Pierre Omidyar is, although he was much more creative and interesting and had, a lot more to give to the world. But it's the same basic idea that we're going to hack human frailty and all the problems of the human experience with like machines of convenience that are going to fix things for us. Whereas all prior literature, up until this time, was trying to get us to reconcile with the idea that, we can't escape who we are, and we can't escape our fate, and this is what people are destined to be. But it's not so bad, right? Like, it can be heroic, it can be ridiculous, but it's what we are. But this new argument came. Mm-hmm.
Well, with a proviso, it wasn't all literature that was kind of fatalistic and humanist before. There was something before dystopian literature, which we don't have anymore, really, called utopian literature.
That's true.
And it goes back to the Renaissance. And in the Renaissance, people like Bacon and others more imagined, what if all these new ideas, these new sciences, and these new technologies could be put to use for the betterment of humankind? And there was a real, a real surge of imagination to the positive. How can we escape this benighted era and have a perfected way of life? Now, any attempt at utopianism now just drowns in irony and cynicism and skepticism. I mean, I'm trying to think of the last book that was like a utopian bestseller. It might have been in the 70s, a book called Walden 2 by B.F. Skinner, or there was a book by Aldous Huxley, his last novel, called Island, which was about a kind of perfect free love, druggy, sensual society on a Pacific island. But we don't really attempt utopianism much anymore. But we can't understand dystopianism except as a reply to something that did exist. And I think Forster saw in Wells's project something a bit inhuman, something a bit too cold. We remember Forster as the author of the phrase "only connect," and we think of him as a guy who wrote about friendship and love and deep human connection. But he was writing about that because he had this nightmare in the back of his head of total loss of human connection. So what Forster was really doing in his other work what was showing us the solution to the nightmare problem that the machine stops outlines. If he were alive today, I would imagine he would say of Dia, "Listen, man, go go hug your kids, have intense love affairs, hang out with your friends, put the phone away. Life is lived, in company, squeezing flesh, hearing voices, in the humidity of a small room full of people being alive, and spurn this thing. That's what he'd say.
Mm-hmm. Yeah, that's true too. I didn't even think about that utopian angle. Like, if you go back and you mentioned Dostoevsky's Demons, right? So he was satirizing in that book. He was satirizing a book called What Is to Be Done. A little bit. It's I think maybe the worst novel ever written by this author Chernyshevsky, and it's basically like the pre-Bolshevik utopian novel where perfect socialist harmony. Everybody is living in sort of communal perfection. The characters are completely unbelievable, wooden, revolting, like even in their perfect state. And Dostoevsky was trying to kind of laugh at them in that book, which is a very funny book, right? The Demons is a really funny novel.
Right.
But that kind of belief in we're going to create some kind of way around and like an end around, so the basic problems of the human condition, and it's all going to be awesome, and look how easy it'll be. Yeah, I guess that was already in the ether, and then you take it to another level with technology, which I guess is what starts to happen with people like Wells, and you put all those things together. I guess it does make sense, but it just this book is just so right on the money in terms of the things that it predicted about what a world sort of drowning in these technologies of convenience, what it would do to the human soul, and how it would cause certain parts of our character to be atrophied. And you remember a young adult book called The Guardians? You ever read that?
No, I don't think so.
It's another dystopian novel, but it's similar. It's about a world that's divided into an overcrowded city, and then they're like where all the proles live, and then outside is where all the rich people live, and you can't really get there because they've told the proles that there's an electrified fence at the edge of the city, but nobody ever goes there because they've been told it so many times that they don't even bother checking. But one of the characters in the story goes and finds out that actually you can just walk right out, and that's the same thing with this story, where they've repeated so many times that if you go out into the outside air, that it will kill you, that you can't breathe. You can only go out with a respirator on. I mean, God, think about how on the money that is in the current climate. The parallels are unbelievable, and
one thing that happens in the story is that we find out that it is technically possible to go to the surface. There are no rules against it. People do it sometimes. The narrator, the central woman in the story, doesn't see any reason people should go there. It seems a little dangerous and untoward, but you can. But sometime toward the end of the story, the machine stops producing the respirators necessary to go to the surface, and she, rather than being disappointed, simply absorbs it. It wasn't something we should have ever wanted to do anyway. And I saw that attitude all through COVID, as people gave up various normal behaviors. They rationalized it with, who liked that anyway? I'd rather get all my meals delivered to the door. I never liked restaurants that much in the first place. And this really kind of unattractive old lady who's at the center of the story is the vehicle for Forster to articulate all these kind of compromises and rationales and excuses that we make when our lives are being drained of vitality.
Mm-hmm. Mm-hmm. Yeah, this is what happens when you don't have to move, you don't have to think, you're told everything. Um, that old woman, Vashti, right, is her name in the story.
Yeah.
She just becomes this receptacle of received ideas, uh, just totally uninteresting person, with a mishmash of fears that are kind of protective, but there's no person really there in the end. I mean, um, she's she's been so eaten away by all this, and it's not by any like cruel political process necessarily. It's just that she's given up everything
Yeah.
that makes us human, and boy, does that sound familiar. It's just
Well, it reminds
then,
you of it reminds you of the anti WEF meme. I won't eat the bugs, I won't live in the pod. Um, this is a story about living in the pod. I can't quite remember what they eat. And it's a little bit like the WEF dream turned upside down. Instead of 15-minute cities, you have 5-second honeycombed cells, that you actually lack any desire to escape, because who wants to put themselves in danger? And you've got the screen. In some ways, this story is like a hard kernel from which almost all the other dystopian novels of the 20th century grew. It reminds you of the telescreen world in which the Fahrenheit 451 people live. It has the kind of grayness and irrationality of 1984, where there's a central committee, but nobody really knows what it does or how to get to it. It has something of the sort of laboratory-like setting of Brave New World.
we also, yeah,
your children are. One thing interesting about the mother in the story is she's very detached from her own son. He was taken away from her right after birth. It seems that women in this situation are kind of, hatchers of children, not mothers of them. And the boy's been away for so long and has sort of drifted in his sensibility in a way that she doesn't approve of. So at one point she refers to him as a man who used to be my son. They've basically dissolved all loyalty, connection, and
yeah. There's the war against parental connection, and where does that sound? I mean, that sounds pretty familiar too, right? Doesn't it?
Well, it takes a village, man, and sometimes the village takes the child. And why anybody should be called a conspiracy theorist when all they are doing is recognizing patterns that were laid down by our greatest writers over 150 years or 120 years ago, and taught in our schools for an entire century and universities, and now cause us to be alert to certain patterns, and we're punished for noticing. I hate that. I hate having my damn literary education used against me as though it's some kind of fever dream that emerged from me individually. Wait, the machine stops, and literature that arose in this channel, this dystopian channel, has so many lessons for us that you'd have to be, knocked out unconscious not to see them. And yet to cite them and to explore them at any length gets you labeled some kind of, it used to be that you would be labeled a good student, but now you're labeled a suspicious person.
I was gonna say, then this is the last thing I'll say, but it wasn't that long ago. Even remember when WALL-E came out?
Yes. WALL-E reminds me of The Machine Stops.
Very much so, right? It's got a lot in common with it's a little bit more vibrant and fun
Right.
looking, that life,
Right.
but it's a whole bunch of people, obese, formless people with no ideas driving around in their what do they call those things? The carts that everybody has in Walmart. Um, uh, I can't remember what they're called. There's a really funny word for it. Anyway, but you know what I'm talking about, right?
Oh,
You've been
sure.
to Oklahoma and you've seen that whole thing. In Wally, it's a future society where people have for so long stopped thinking on their own. All they do is they drive around and look at a screen all day long. And the movie is supposed to, in really kind of a beautiful, like sort of Chaplin-esque way, I think, um, is satirizing how sad that is, and reminding us that just one little blade of grass and romantic love, um, in the midst of all that, can transform the world, and it can be a beautiful, wonderful thing, and that we have to
Right.
fight against that as people, like, and that was a mainstream movie like not that long ago. I think the message would be very opposite now. No, I mean,
Let's get real about Wall-E. I it fat shames. Okay, in the current parlance, there's just no getting around it. Wall-E tries to make objects of ridicule of heavy people. That's one of its main visual motifs. That's completely uncool
that's true.
In the current situation. Um, it's a problematic movie, to use the political rhetoric, and but it may have been the last of those classic dystopian stories for that reason, in that it proclaimed a kind of end for mankind in obese passivity that I think has been revised. In any case, I'm looking for the woke utopian novel. One thing that I haven't seen yet is an articulation, a positive, affirmative articulation of the future that we're all supposed to embrace. I don't know if there's a book that anybody would read in that. I don't know if it would be like Bug Bites, which we discussed the other week, just a ridiculous pamphlet full of propaganda. But there should be, given the inertia of this new utopian drive toward a better world as seen in Dia, why don't we have any novelistic portrayals of what it's like to have a state and a smartphone that inspire us to go get one? I think it's unfair of the powers that be to expect us to cheer the coming of a state and a smartphone without dramatizing for us in a compelling human way why that should be desirable. You know,
Maybe we
um,
should write it.
you're right. Let's write the best case scenario for all the shit we've been deploring. They don't seem to be able to make a very moving excuse for their plans. The best they can do is have these weird electronic voices in conference halls say things like, "You will be able to get a mortgage and turn in your neighbor." I think I can do a better job of making the youth of America want a state and a smartphone, and we should write that. Like, how can I put it? Propaganda whose job is to be so inspiring and in a fake way that it ultimately revolts you.
Maybe we should try to write the woke version of What Is to Be Done. Like, I mean, that book is laugh out loud funny and how off putting it is. But yeah, there should be an American version of that, and nobody's written it yet.
And actually, it troubles me that they're not able even in a cartoon way to draw Jetsons style, the woke Jetsons world that we're supposed to welcome. it worries me that they don't have a real plan for a positive achievement, that we're kind of being conned here. I got to say, when I heard DIA described, no images of happy DIA users came to mind. I just saw a lot of people scared of each other, worried about their ratings, obsessed with their phone and their ranking and their status. It was hard to see that Disney-esque pink cloud, future deoccupied Ukraine in my mind.
Yeah, I didn't see it either. Well, let's put our heads together and think about how we're going to write that novel. And
you have a cartoonist.
Yeah, absolutely. I think we can do it.
It could be a graphic novel. Yeah.
It might even have to be, right? So, I think that would be great. Let's work on that. Walter, it's been awesome. This is a really another super interesting conversation. Thanks to everybody who listened in, and I'll see you next week.
Okay, man. We will. Okay.